Now, you're self-employed, you never know what sort of work will come through your door. And last week I got a set of these chairs in for a bit of TLC. And straight away, these chairs have quite an interesting history in their own right. But prior to speaking about the chairs, the house that the chairs came out of also has an interesting history from the point of view of the owner of the property. So just to go back a little bit in history, just to give the provenance of the story of the house where the chairs came from and the chairs themselves, I'd just like to recount the tale of Sir John Franklin's expedition to determine or to find the Northwest Passage back in 1845, when he set sail with the two boats, Erebus and the Terror, and his two naval officers were Francis Crozier and James Fitzjames. The expedition, as history is well recorded, failed due to they got locked in ice and they had to abandon ship. So all 129 of the crew died through scurvy, malnutrition. Some of the tinned food they had, they reckoned that the lead that sealed the tinned food leaked in, so they were eating food that was contaminated, and also the lead piping that was their water source would have also contained high lead content, which would have been detrimental to health, of course. It was also speculated at the time, stories that was given by the Inuits some time later to John Ray, that they had succumbed to cannibalism, which abhorred the Victorian society at the time when the story was leaked to the press. And it was finally proven in, I think, 1997 or something like that, that they did indeed find bone where the marrow had been boiled out for some of the crew to survive on, and had resorted to cannibalism. However, the man that came from the house where these chairs have also come from, it's called Clonacoady House. It's less than a mile from where I live here. It's near Fetherton, County Tipperary. And the man that came from there, he's born up there in 2nd November in 1806, and his name is Henry Kellett. He was an Irish naval officer who joined the Royal Navy, and he was famous for charting territories down in the southern seas in China and South America and so on. And in 1848 he was tasked with a boat called the Herald to go in search of Franklin's expedition to see what happened to her, if they could ascertain any information. And Sir John Franklin's wife was always behind, trying to find out whatever happened to them. So in 1848, under the command of the Herald, he set sail to try and find out what happened to Franklin's expedition. They weren't successful on that one, and then subsequently, a few years later, I think in 1852, he captained the Resolute, which also had very interesting history. But that got stranded. He was ordered to abandon ship there, which he reluctantly did, but he followed orders. The Resolute then in turn was found by an American whaling ship. It was brought to the United States. It was put back in condition, good condition, sailing condition, and it was presented back to Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria in turn, when the ship was decommissioned, had some of the timbers stripped from it, and they made it into a desk that now adorns the Oval Office in America. So there's just a little bit of history from the Franklin expedition. The man that lived in this house, Clonacoady House, close to here, and the desk that adorns the White House, the Oval Office, is the Resolute. Timbers from the Resolute were used to make the Oval Desk, or the desk in the Oval Office. Now we're back to the chairs here. These particular chairs, it's known as the Tuam Chair, or it's also called the Sligo Chair, and it has an interesting history, and it's also got an interesting history from the point of view of Henry Kellett. Lived from 1802 up to, and he died on, I think, the 1st of March in 1875, and he's buried in Fethard. These chairs have a history dating back in Ireland. They'd be of the vernacular, which specifically, or probably state, not specifically, but would generally state that they were an Irish country furniture piece. So the first documentary evidence of them, I suppose, is back in the same century that Henry Kellett would have lived. So the 1830s, there's documentary evidence in around 1830s. And they weren't specifically or definitely associated with the wealthy. Back in those times, prior to the famine, of course, they wouldn't have had a huge amount of hardwood trees. A lot of the trees plantations in Ireland were stripped for boat building and so on, great oaks and so on. However, elm would probably have been well in abundance, And these particular chairs, it may have started with this, I don't know. This is the armed version of it, but they were found to be in Tuam, and they were also found to be in Mayo. So I've always known it as the Mayo chair, but it's also known as the Tuam Chair. And as far as I'm aware, there's a company in the west of Ireland, in Tuam, still producing these chairs. These chairs specifically were produced in Tuam, and I think the owner of the house at present said in 1962 or 3 or thereabouts, in the 1960s. But the history of them goes back to around the 1830s, when it was being documented as an Irish chair. Now, Ireland doesn't have a huge history in furniture making if we go back. So the design may have come from Scotland or the English bringing over skills, or it could have been influenced from European furniture of the time. It has 3 legs, as you can see here, and I suppose having 3 legs and the backsplash, just the one that goes to the floor. With earthen floors in Ireland, floors would have been uneven, so the 3-legged stool or the 3-legged chair would have been a better fit for a country house. Also, given the fact that houses were tiny back in those centuries prior to the famine, they'd have had low light with small windows, as the tax on windows, which we used to call daylight robbery. Houses were small. Furniture would have been regarded as a luxury, or would have been required as something that would actually bring you to close to the heart of fire, that you'd be able to sit down to get some heat. So this particular one, I suppose, if we call it a carver, has the arms on it, so it's more ornate, it's larger in size as well. But they're beautifully constructed, and the chairs themselves, these ones are made from teak now, but they're peg construction, so you've got turning in them. In this particular one here, you've got tenons, you've got a recessed tenon there, so quite strong structure. You'll have tenons here and also, and they're peg joints. So the timbers, they would probably traditionally have been made of wood, I would say, may have been elm or ash or whatever was available. And they are documented in history, and well documented up the west. So they're known as the Mayo chair, as I said, or the Tuam chair. So they have tusk tenons, and a tusk tenon is just a tenon that resembles a tusk from a walrus, let's say, and they're driven in there to give solidity to the back piece. You'll notice little ornate carving there in the back of it there, it's finger grip, and the actual back leg is swept. Now, back in, I think, 1918, I think, if I have my history correct, W.B. Yeats ordered a set of these to Gracie's house in Tuam in Ballylee, for his tower house that he renovated, and he requisitioned a set of these. As far as I'm aware, they made the backsplash straight. I'm not quite certain of that, I may be corrected on that. But W.B. Yeats wanted to adorn his house with Irish vernacular furniture, so he chose a set of these to Gracie's home. He wanted to make all his furniture, he wanted local made, not imported and not mass produced. So he was after the craftsmanship that went into these. These particular chairs also have wedge tenons to hold them together, which strengthens the joint there, gives it more oomph, bang for buck. They may not have been glued originally, because if we're thinking back to the 1830s, furniture making wasn't a huge concern. Survival was more a concern for the proletariat, or the general Irish person. So these were pegged, they were just dowelled, going through the joints. Now, if they were glued at all, I would imagine it would have been animal glue, which would have been used, which I can show in a later video. So I've got these into repair. So these come out, these are from the house from Henry Kellett. It's called the Mayo chair and the Tuam chair. So we got to take these back and give them a new lease of life, to put them back where they belong, in the condition they belong in. So if I take this one over here, if we look at the chair itself, I've just taken this one apart, and the actual tenons there, lovely swept tenons there. This one was glued, so it looks, I know by looking at it that it's not a PVA glue because of the age of the chair, it's actually an animal glue. So it's a glue that would be heated, and then it would be put into the joint. So it's applied hot. Little dowels, jointing supporting the the point of construction here, which are the swept little wings, it's a triangular chair form, of course. So you have a straight front, you've got a plank form here, and you've got plank form here. And then there's an interesting little stretcher rail which goes from rectangular back to circular, and it's pegged on the back also. So it goes from rectangular here, rectangular section, to round, which is quite nice. And the spigot comes through here and it's wedged again. So the weakest part of the chair, I would imagine, is at this point here. So I've got to take these apart, give them some TLC, clean them down, and we'll probably, more than likely, give them a coat of oil just to give them a finish. So the search for Franklin's expedition continued after Henry Kellett's adventures, and in 1854 John Ray, who was a Scottish surgeon, he was doing his own Arctic exploration of Boothia, as far as I'm aware, and he came across the Inuit people who relayed the story of Franklin's men having abandoned ship, who succumbed to starvation and had actually resorted to cannibalism. This was greeted in Victorian society with abhorrence when the story was leaked to the press, and John Ray lived in ignominy. He wasn't awarded any special crosses for polar exploration, yet he was a man who was an intrepid explorer who had adopted the ways of the Inuit people, designed his own trekking shoes for ice and snow, and looked to the locals for the experience of travelling long distances with carrying little supplies or little weight on his back. The general consensus by the British public or the explorers of the time was, or Victorian society, was that there was little to be learned from the Inuit people because they were too primitive for to have any information that would be of educational value, which of course, contrary to the belief at the time, was exactly what the explorers should have been taken on board, was the experiences of the people that lived in that particular climate. The fate of the two ships was unknown, or the location of them, and yet in recent years, in 2014 and 16, the actual wrecks of both the Erebus and the Terror were discovered in the waters of King William Island. But the two